The alarm screamed through the bridge of the survey vessel Gentle Seeker, and Captain Zixta felt her 6 legs lock in instinctive fear response as every sensor on her ship suddenly blazed red with impossible readings. Her second officer, Crystalline Lumine, named Crystallis, whose body refracted light into dancing rainbows even in moments of crisis, turned its faceted head toward her with movements that suggested barely controlled panic. Captain, the spatial fold is opening where nothing should exist, Crystallis said in its chiming voice that normally brought calm but now carried undertones of genuine terror. The mathematics are all wrong, and the energy signature matches nothing in our databases. Ixtha forced her mandibles to relax and her breathing to steady, as she was trained to do in her 200 years of service to the Confluence fleet, though every instinct screamed at her to flee as fast as her engines could carry them away from this cursed sector of space near the galactic rim where even stars were sparse. In cold analysis mode engaged, she commanded, and her voice stayed level, despite the primal fear crawling up her thorax. Record everything and prepare jump drives for emergency evacuation, but hold position until we understand what we face. The fold in space rippled like water disturbed by some vast creature moving beneath the surface, and then it tore open with a soundless violence that every living being on the bridge somehow felt in their bones or equivalent structures, despite the vacuum of space carrying no medium for such sensations. What emerged made Zix the question whether her compound eyes were malfunctioning or whether 2 centuries of experience had prepared her for absolutely nothing. The vessel that drifted through the impossible tear in reality was ancient beyond ancient in its design, spoke of engineering principles that predated the Confluence itself by epochs uncounted, yet it moved with a grace that suggested technology far beyond what its primitive appearance would indicate. Run historical comparisons, Zixta ordered, and her voice came out as barely more than a whisper now. Check every database we have access to and find me something that matches those hull markings. The ship before them was enormous, but not by modern standards. Where? Confluence. Vessels routinely stretched for kilometers in elegant curves of living metal and crystallized, thought made manifest in physical form. Yet something about its proportions suggested it had been built by beings who thought differently about space and purpose, and the relationship between the 2 crystallas worked in silence for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, before its voice chimed again with a note of disbelief that Zixa had never heard from her normally unflappable officer in all their years serving together. Captain, I have a match, but you will not believe what the archives tell us, Crystallis said, and now its crystal body was flickering through colors that indicated extreme confusion mixed with something approaching. The markings are human, and the design matches fragments we have from the ruins they left behind. Zixta felt her legs go weak again, and she had to lock them consciously to avoid embarrassing herself before her crew. Because humanity was a word that belonged to children's stories and academic curiosities, not 2 functional warships appearing from nowhere in the present-day reality of galactic civilization that is impossible. She said flatly, humanity has been extinct for 20,000 years, and even when they existed, they were barely capable of interstellar travel using crude fusion drives that would make a modern engineer weep with pity. Nevertheless, the match is absolute, Crystallis insisted, and brought up holographic displays that showed the markings on the ghost ship beside archive samples from human ruins scattered across 12 worlds in the inner galactic sectors. See here and here, the writing system is identical, and even the stylistic elements match what we know of late human stellar engineering before they vanished. Zixta studied the evidence with growing unease because the implications were staggering in ways that made her mind struggle to encompass the possibilities being presented by mere facts and sensor readings. Scan for life signs, she commanded, because protocol existed for situations even as bizarre as this one, and prepare a boarding team, but treat this as a potential first contact scenario. Despite the historical impossibility of what we face, the sensors swept the silent vessel and came back with readings that made even less sense than its sudden appearance from a fold in space that violated every known principle of jump drive technology and spatial mechanics. Captain, I am detecting 247 distinct biological signatures aboard that vessel, sensor officer reported in a tone that suggested he was double and triple checking his instruments before trusting them enough to speak they register as human based on archived biological data, but they are in some form of stasis that our sensors cannot fully analyze. Zixta made a decision that would later be recorded in history. Archives across the confluence and studied by strategists and first contact specialists for generations to come, though, at that moment, she was simply following her training. And her gut instinct honed over 2 centuries of encountering the strange and unexplained in the void. Between stars transmit this data. Immediately to Confluence Central Command using quantum entanglement communication. She ordered with her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority now. Mark it as priority level Omega and request immediate council session to address potential return of an extinct species. She paused and looked at the ancient human vessel, drifting silent and mysterious before her ship, while her mind raced through scenarios and possibilities and worst-case outcomes that could reshape galactic civilization and send word to the historians and the xenorchaeologists. She added after a moment of consideration, "Tell them to bring everything we know about humanity, because we may need to understand them very quickly and very thoroughly if we want to survive whatever comes." Next, the gentle seeker held position. As messages flashed across the galaxy at speeds that defied normal space and time, carrying news that would shake the foundations of everything the Confluence thought it knew about history and extinction and the permanence of death on a species-wide scale inside the ghost ship that humanity had sent back across 20,000 years of absence. 247 people slept in perfect preservation, dreaming dreams of a mission they thought would take only months, but which had somehow stretched into epochs, while they waited in frozen sleep for the moment when they would wake, to a galaxy that had forgotten them entirely and, in the deepest core of the ship, buried beneath layers of technology that would make Confluence engineers question everything they thought they knew about physics and possibility. A message waited in quantum encryption that no living species could break, holding secrets that would soon cascade across known space like dominoes falling in patterns, too vast to see until the final piece toppled and revealed the shape of truth that had been hidden for 200 centuries. The boarding team assembled in the airlock of Gentle Seeker wore the best protective equipment the Confluence could manufacture and carried sensors calibrated to detect threats ranging from biological contamination to exotic radiation that could rewrite atomic structures at the quantum level. Yet Captain Zixta knew that no amount of preparation could truly ready anyone for entering a vessel that should not exist. "Commander." Tailshin led the team, and the aquatic being's environmental suit sloshed quietly with the nutrient-rich water that kept their gill structures functioning in the dry atmosphere most species preferred aboard mixed crew vessels, while their tentacles manipulated controls with practiced efficiency born of 3 decades in Confluence Security Services. Remember that we know nothing about what we will find aboard that vessel. Tailshin reminded the team through the communication link that connected all their suits. Treat everything as potentially hostile and maintain quarantine protocols at all times, because we cannot risk contaminating either our ship or theirs. With unknown factors, the boarding tube extended across the void between vessels and locked onto the hull of the human ship with mechanical precision that somehow felt inadequate, given the strangeness of their target. Then cutting torches began working on the outer airlock because the human vessel refused to respond to any hailing frequencies or standard docking protocols the Confluence had developed over 10,000 years of peaceful cooperation between species. What happened next would be discussed and analyzed and argued about in academic papers and military strategy sessions for years to come, because the moment the cutting torches breached the outer hull, the human ship came alive. Lights flickered on throughout the vessel, in patterns that suggested awakening rather than mere automated response, and the airlock suddenly cycled open from the inside, as though the ship had simply been waiting politely for them to announce their presence before granting entry like a host welcoming guests into their home that should not be possible. Crystallis said over the communication channel from the bridge of Gentle Seeker, where they monitored every sensor reading with growing bewilderment, "The ship has been without power for what our analysis suggests is at minimum several thousand years." Tailshin made a decision that balanced caution with curiosity and gestured for the team to proceed into the human vessel, while every instinct they possessed screamed warnings about situations that seemed too convenient, and threats that, war-friendly faces, the interior of the ship made no sense. According to any engineering principles, the immense confluence had developed across its 10,000-year history of stellar civilization, because the corridors stretched farther than the external dimensions of the vessels should allow, and the walls seemed to shimmer with properties that suggested they existed in more dimensions than the standard for that most. Species experienced Captain Zixtha. You need to see these readings, Talshin reported while their scientific training warred with the evidence before their eyes. This vessel contains folded dimensional spaces that should require energy outputs equivalent to a small star just to maintain, and yet our sensors detect no power source capable of generating such forces. The boarding team moved deeper into the ship, following corridors that curved in ways that seemed to defy geometry until they reached what could only be described as a chamber designed for suspended animation on a scale that suggested the humans who built this vessel had been planning for a very long journey. Indeed, 247 pods filled the chamber in neat rows, and each one contained a human preserved in perfect stasis that looked more like sleep than death, despite the impossible span of years that had passed since these people had closed their eyes and trusted their machines to keep them safe. Talshin approached the nearest pod with scientific curiosity, overriding the natural caution that had kept their species alive through 3 major galactic conflicts, and peered through the transparent surface at the human woman sleeping within. Noting the strange bilateral symmetry and the patch on her uniform that matched symbols from the ancient human ruins scattered across the inner galaxy, they looked so fragile. One of the team members whispered with something approaching pity in their voice. No natural armor, and no apparent adaptations for hostile environments, and yet their species spread across dozens of star systems before they vanished.
Out.
The pod suddenly emitted a sound that made every member of the boarding team jump in startled response, and lights began flashing across its surface in patterns that suggested critical systems engaging or possibly failing. Nobody could tell which, because human technology remained completely opaque to confluence analysis. The stasis field is degrading, Crystallis shouted from the gentle seeker with genuine alarm clear in their chiming voice. That pod is going to open within minutes, and we have no idea what condition the occupant will be in after 20,000 years of suspension. Talshin faced another decision that would echo through history. Chose to stay rather than evacuate because first contact protocols demanded that someone be present when the human woke, even if that someone had no idea how to communicate with a species that had been extinct longer than most. Confluence civilizations had existed. The pod hissed open with ancient hydraulics that somehow still functioned perfectly, and the human woman inside took her first breath in 20 millennia, with a gasping sound that somehow seemed entirely ordinary, despite the extraordinary circumstances of her awakening. Her eyes opened and focused on Talshin with startling quickness for someone who should be disoriented after such long sleep, and her hand moved to her side where a weapon had probably once been holstered, though the pod contained no such equipment now. Status report, the human woman said in a language that the translation software struggled with for several seconds before finding enough archive data to make sense of her words. How long to the rendezvous point, and has the rest of the fleet reported? In Talshin felt their tentacles curl in the gesture their species used to indicate extreme awkwardness mixed with sympathy for difficult news that had to be delivered despite knowing it would cause pain. Course, they said slowly while the translator converted their words into something the human could understand. And I regret to inform you that you have been in stasis for approximately 20,000 standard years, during which time humanity appears to have completely vanished from known space. The human woman stared at Talshin for a long moment, and her face went through several expressions that the commander's xenopsychology training helped identify as shock, followed by disbelief, followed by a desperate hope that this was somehow a joke or a mistake that is impossible. She said finally, and her voice carried absolute certainty, despite the evidence of alien beings surrounding her pod. We launched only 6 months ago under the Exodus Protocol, and our mission timeline called for a maximum of 2 years before we returned to report our findings. She sat up in the pod with movements that seemed remarkably controlled given the circumstances, and read the nameplate on her own uniform as though reminding herself of her own identity. "I am Commander Elise Chen, of the human Stellar Navy vessel Eschaton's Wake," she said with formal precision, "and I need to speak with your superior officers immediately, because if what you say is true, then everything has gone terribly wrong in humanity." May already be lost. Tailshin looked at this human woman who had skipped across 20,000 years like a stone across water, and felt the weight of history pressing down on this moment, because whatever came next would reshape the galaxy in ways that nobody could predict. "Commander Chen," Tailshin said gently, "you and your crew are the first humans anyone has seen in 200 centuries, and your return has already shaken the foundations of everything we thought we knew about extinction and permanence, and the nature of loss on a cosmic scale." Commander Elise Chen sat in what the Confluence called a hospitality suite, but what felt more like a very comfortable prison cell, and tried to process the fact that everyone she had ever known, dust scattered across 20,000 years of time that had passed in what felt like a single night of sleep. The Confluence Council had been debating her fate for 3 days. Now, while she remained in quarantine aboard the station they had brought her to, after extracting her from Escatons, Wake Asterisk, and she could see them through the transparent walls arguing in a dozen different languages that her translator implant struggled to parse despite its sophisticated neural integration television. Visited every day and brought her food that approximated human nutritional needs based on archaeological evidence from human ruins. Because nobody alive remembered what humans actually ate, and the aquatic commander seemed genuinely distressed by the situation, despite having no emotional obligation to a member of an extinct species. "The Council fears you," Tailshin explained during one visit while their tentacles performed the curling gesture that Chen had learned meant apologetic discomfort. "They remember fragmentary records that describe humanity as unpredictable, prone to violence when threatened, and your sudden appearance has triggered every paranoid scenario that politicians can imagine." Chen laughed bitterly at that, because humanity had indeed been violent when she went into stasis, but they had also been desperate and running from something that made violence seem like a child's game in comparison to the existential threat bearing down on the galaxy. "Tell your council that I will help them decrypt the ship's logs," Chen offered after considering her limited options. "In exchange, they wake my crew under supervised conditions and guarantee their safety regardless of what the logs reveal." The negotiation took another week, but eventually the council agreed. Because curiosity outweighed fear just enough to tip the balance, and Chen found herself standing before a holographic interface linked to Eschaton's Wake, while a dozen confluent scientists watched her every movement like she was a bomb that might explode at any moment. Her fingers moved across the interface in patterns that looked like random gestures to the observers, but which triggered quantum keys embedded in her genetic code and neural patterns, because humanity had learned to take security seriously in the desperate days before the Exodus. The ship's logs opened like a flower blooming in fast motion, and data began flooding into Confluence systems faster than their computers could process it, because human information density had apparently exceeded anything the current galactic civilization had developed 20,000 years ago. "We detected something approaching from beyond the galactic rim," Chen narrated, while the logs displayed images and sensor data that made the Confluence scientists lean forward despite their caution. "Our best scientists called it the Harvester, and our worst scientists called it the end of all biological life. In the universe, the images showed something that seemed to defy description, and the human sensors that had captured it struggled to represent what they detected in ways that logical minds could process. But the basic truth was clear enough to make the scientists watching go very quiet and very still. It consumed everything." Chen continued, and her voice stayed level through training and sheer willpower. Entire star systems vanished as it passed through them, and what emerged on the other side was nothing but empty space scrubbed clean of matter down to individual atoms. The logs showed humanity's desperate calculations and their conclusion that no conventional military force could stop something that treated stars like food and planets, like inconvenient obstacles to be cleared from its path. "We launched the Exodus Protocol," Chen said, and pulled up files that showed the largest coordinated effort humanity had ever attempted. "Every ship we could build and every person who could fit aboard them fled beyond the galactic rim. or we hope to find some way to fight back, or at least survive long enough to warn others. She paused and brought up the mission parameters for Ascaton's wake specifically while the confluence. Scientists absorbed information that rewrote their understanding of galactic history. We were sent back as heralds. Chen explained our ship contained quantum triggers tied to specific cosmic conditions that would wake us and pull us back to normal space when the time was right to deliver our warning. Tailshin spoke up from where they had been observing, quietly in the corner, and their voice carried a question that everyone in the room was thinking but afraid to ask Commander Chen. Your ship returned now after 20,000 years. They said carefully, what cosmic conditions were you programmed to respond to? Chen pulled up the final log entry and felt her heart sink as she read the data, because some part of her had been hoping that the timing was coincidence or malfunction rather than the alternative. We were programmed to return when the harvester approached within 1,000 light-years of the galactic rim, she said quietly, and according to these readings, that threshold was crossed approximately 3 months ago. The room erupted in controlled chaos as scientists shouted for confirmations and military officers demanded access to confluence sensor networks, while politicians tried to maintain order over communication channels that suddenly blazed with emergency traffic. There is more, Chen said loudly enough to cut through the noise, and the room went silent again because her tone carried the weight of information that would make the current crisis seem manageable by comparison. Humanity did not just run away to hide. She continued and pulled up files that had been locked behind additional encryption requiring council authorization to access. We spent 20,000 years learning and building and evolving because we knew we would have to come back eventually. Files opened and showed things that made the confluence scientists gasp, in reactions that ranged from wonder to horror because the images displayed technology that seemed to violate everything they understood about physics and biology and the relationship between consciousness and matter. We found something out there beyond the rim, Chen said, and allowed herself a small smile for the first time since waking. Something old and powerful and willing to teach us how to fight back. She brought up the final file, and it showed a fleet of ships that dwarfed anything the confluence had ever built, while incorporating design principles that suggested humanity had learned to think in ways that transcended the limitations of three-dimensional space. The harvester is coming, Chen said with absolute certainty, but humanity is coming too. And we bring with us 20,000 years of preparation and the desperate hope that we are not too late to save the civilizations that rose in our absence. Tailshin moved closer to the display and studied the images of the human fleet with tentacles that trembled slightly because the implications were staggering in ways that made political concerns seem trivial. How long until humanity arrives? They asked, though part of them was not sure they wanted to know the answer. Chen checked the quantum link that connected Ascaton's wake to the main fleet and felt tears prick her eyes as she read the response, because it meant that her desperate gamble across 20 millennia had actually worked. The first elements of the human armada will arrive in confluence space within 2 weeks, she said, and they bring with them weapons and knowledge and allies that will either save this galaxy or die trying. She turned to face the Confluence Council members, who watched through holographic links from their various homeworlds, and spoke. With the authority of someone who had crossed time itself to deliver a message, you have a choice to make. Chen told them bluntly, you can treat us as invaders and waste precious time fighting among ourselves while the harvester approaches, or you can trust that humanity remembers its old neighbors and came back to stand with them against the darkness that consumes worlds. The silence that followed her words stretched for heartbeats that felt like hours, until finally one of the council members spoke. Wake her crew, they commanded, and prepare the Confluence fleet for war. The awakening of the Ascaton's wake crew took 3 days in Commander. Chen stood by each pod as her people opened their eyes to a galaxy that had forgotten them, while Tailshin coordinated with Confluence medical staff to ensure that nobody died from the shock of learning they had lost 20,000 years in what felt like a single night. Lieutenant Marcus Park was the last to wake, and the navigation specialist took the news better than most because his training in relativistic physics had already prepared him to think about time as something flexible and negotiable rather than the steady constant that most people assume. So we are famous Park said with a grin that seemed inappropriate given the circumstances, the crew that came back from extinction to save the galaxy. Chen did not smile because she knew that fame would not matter much if the Harvester arrived before humanity could organize a defense, and the Confluence still treated her crew with suspicion that bordered on hostility despite the Council's official cooperation. The human crew began sharing what they knew about the technology Escaton's wake contained, and Confluence engineers struggled to understand principles that seemed to violate causality and thermodynamics in ways that made their advanced degrees feel like kindergarten certificates. This is not possible, one engineer insisted while examining the dimensional folding system that let the ship contain spaces larger than its external volume. The energy requirements alone should collapse the vessel into a microscopic black hole. Park shrugged and activated systems that had been dormant for 20 millennia with the casual confidence of someone who had helped design them back when humanity was desperate enough to try anything that might work. Humanity stopped worrying about whether things were possible around the time we accepted that extinction was inevitable without radical innovation. He explained, "We focused instead on whether things worked, and this works beautifully once you stop trying to make it obey rules that only apply in normal space." The days ticked by with agonizing slowness while Confluence fleets assembled and politicians argued about command structures and humanity's role in the coming conflict. Then the sensors detected something that made every argument instantly irrelevant. The Harvester arrived early, and it came not as a single entity, but as a swarm of autonomous constructs that spread across star systems like infection spreading through a body, while breaking down matter into base components and sorting it for purposes that no biological mind could comprehend. Confluence fleets engaged with everything they had accumulated over 10,000 years of peaceful technological development, and the results were catastrophic in ways that made Chen feel sick. Despite expecting exactly this outcome, weapons that could crack planets bounced harmlessly off. Harvester constructs and shields that could tank supernova-level energy output failed within seconds against tools designed to disassemble matter at the quantum level, while Confluence crews died by the thousands as their ships were methodically taken apart. Fall back, the Confluence fleet commander ordered, and Chen could hear the desperation in their voice. Retreat to secondary defensive positions and prepare for last stand protocols. Chen stood on the bridge of the Confluence flagship, where the Council had reluctantly allowed her to observe, and felt the weight of 20,000 years pressing down on her shoulders. Because humanity was still 2 days away, and the galaxy was dying now then. Space tore open across 100 different points in patterns that suggested coordination on a scale that made Confluence military doctrine look like children playing with toys. In the human armada emerged into real space with the kind of entrance that would be remembered for the rest of galactic history. Ships that came through defied every expectation Chen had carried from her own time, because humanity not just improved their technology, but had fundamentally transformed their entire approach to engineering and warfare and existence itself. Vessels that seemed to be grown rather than built moved with organic grace, while incorporating materials that flickered between states of matter in ways that hurt to observe directly, and their hulls bore markings that mixed human languages with symbols Chen did not recognize from sources that must have taught humanity secrets during their 20,000-year exile. "This is Admiral Marcus Zhang of the Human Armada to all Confluence vessels." A voice announced across open channels, "We have returned to honor the alliance our ancestors fled from, to stand with you against the threat that chased us into the darkness beyond the rim." Chen felt tears stream down her face because the name Zhang had been common in her time, but hearing it now made her wonder about the generations that separated her from this admiral who commanded forces she could barely comprehend. The Human Armada engaged the Harvester constructs with tactics that seemed to make no sense until Chen realized she was watching combat that operated across more dimensions than human senses could perceive, while using physics that her own time period had barely theorized about. Ships vanished from one point and appeared at another without crossing the space between, while weapons now fired backwards through time to destroy targets before they could complete their attacks. And somehow, nothing collapsed into paradox because humanity had learned to dance With causality itself, they are magnificent, Tailshin whispered from beside. Chen and the aquatic commander's voice carried awe that transcended species boundaries. Your people did not just survive, and they did not just evolve, but they became something that can fight the unfightable. The battle raged for hours, and the harvester constructs that had seemed unstoppable suddenly found themselves matched against an enemy that refused to fight fair or follow rules about what was possible and normal. Space-time human ships coordinated with confluence forces in ways that suggested they had been planning this integration for years, and Chen realized with a start that they probably had because humanity would have been monitoring confluence development through the entire 20,000-year exile, a massive harvester construct that had destroyed 17 confluence capital ships turned its attention toward the human flagship, and Chen watched helplessly as weapons that could vaporize planets focused on a single target. Human flagship did not dodge or raise shields, but instead seemed to fold in on itself in ways that made Chun's eyes water, and when the harvester weapon fired, it passed through empty space, where the ship had been existing in dimensions that normal matter could not reach. Then the flagship unfolded back into normal space directly beside the harvester construct and deployed something that looked like a bloom of crystallized mathematics that wrapped around the enemy vessel and simply stopped it from existing, as its quantum state was rewritten to exclude it from reality confluence forces. "This is Admiral Zhang," the human commander said, and now Chen could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "We are transmitting tactical updates to all vessels in request. You integrate your weapon systems with our coordination network because we fight better together than apart." The Confluence Fleet commander looked at Chen, and she could see the question in their eyes about whether to trust these humans who had returned after 20,000 years with godlike powers and weapons that violated natural law. "My people came back," Chen said quietly. "They could have stayed hidden beyond the rim where the harvester cannot reach, but they chose to return because humanity has always been too stubborn to abandon others to darkness, even when we barely survived ourselves." The Confluence commander nodded and opened channels that would let human and alien systems merge in ways that would either create the most powerful combined fleet in galactic history or result in catastrophic systems failures. The integration worked flawlessly because humanity had designed their systems to be compatible with Confluence technology. Despite 20,000 years of development, divergence, and suddenly, alien crews were seeing tactical displays that showed them threats and opportunities they had never known how to perceive. The tide of battle shifted as confluence weapons found weak points in harvester constructs that human sensors identified, while human ships drew fire away from damaged alien vessels that fell back to repair and rearm under the protection of reality warping defensive fields. By the time the last harvester construct was reduced to scattered atoms, the combined fleet had lost 30% of its strength, but it had won a victory that many had thought impossible and proven that cooperation could overcome even the darkest threats. Admiral Zhang's face appeared on every view screen in the fleet, and Chen studied his features, looking for some trace of the humans she had known 20,000 years ago. Finding it in the determined set of his jaw and the compassion in his eyes when he looked at the casualty reports to all confluence forces. "You have fought with honor and courage against an enemy that has ended countless civilizations across multiple galaxies," Zhang said formally. "Humanity is proud to stand beside you, and we bring an offer of alliance that we hope will last for the next 20,000 years. Chen smiled because she recognized the careful diplomacy in those words and knew that humanity had not just gained power, but had gained wisdom during their long exile. The aftermath of the battle left scars across 17 star systems and memorials on 100 worlds where confluence and human dead were honored together in ceremonies that mixed traditions from species, separated by 20,000 years of history yet united by shared sacrifice. Commander Elise Chen stood in the observation deck of the rebuilt Confluence Station and watched repair ships work alongside human engineering vessels that could manipulate matter at scales that still made her head hurt. Despite 3 months of learning about what humanity had become, Meryl Marcus Zhang found her there, and the man who commanded forces that could reshape reality. still moved with the careful respect of someone approaching a living legend, which made Chen want to laugh because she felt like a relic who had accidentally stumbled into the future. "My crew tells me we are related," Zhang said with a smile that carried warmth across the impossible span of generations. "Your family line survived the Exodus, and I am apparently your direct descendant 800 generations removed." Chen studied his face and tried to imagine the chain of parents and children stretching across 20,000 years from her time to his, while humanity had transformed itself in ways she was still struggling to accept. "Did we win?" she asked quietly, not just this battle, but the larger war, because the Harvester seemed too vast and too patient to be defeated by a single engagement. Zhang nodded and gestured toward the stars beyond the viewport, where space rippled with the invisible presence of human ships maintaining watch over the vulnerable inner galaxy. The Harvester was not a single entity, but a wave of autonomous constructs sent ahead by something even larger. He explained, "We encountered the source during our exile and learned that it was not malevolent, but simply indifferent to biological life, in the same way that a forest fire is indifferent to the ants, whose colony it destroys." He pulled up holographic displays that showed humanity's 20,000-year journey through spaces that existed between galaxies, where the rules of normal physics became negotiable, and consciousness itself could be used as a tool for exploration. "We found others out there." Zhang continued, "Civilizations that had fled from the same threat and learned to exist in ways that transcended matter and energy, and the limitations that biology imposes on thought and growth." Chen absorbed this information and felt simultaneously small and proud, because humanity had not just survived, but had found teachers and allies in the darkness where most species would have found only despair and death. "They taught us to see reality differently," Zhang said, "to understand that the Harvester operates according to principles that seem hostile only because we're thinking in 3 dimensions about a phenomenon that exists across 12. He showed her images of human ships working to establish what he called beacon networks that would detect Harvester incursions early enough to evacuate civilizations before the constructs arrived in force. "We cannot stop the Harvester entirely because it is too vast and too fundamental to the universe's long-term structure," Zhang explained, "but we can protect the spaces where biological life exists and create safe zones that the constructs will root around rather than through." Chen understood the implications and felt her heart swell with pride that was entirely inappropriate, given that she had contributed almost nothing to humanity's achievements over the past 20 millennia. "You came back," she said simply. "Humanity could have stayed hidden beyond the rim where the Harvester cannot reach, but instead you returned to save species you had never met." Zhang's expression grew serious, and he touched the memorial wall where names were being inscribed of all those who had died in the battle, both confluence and human alike. "We came back because we remembered what it felt like to run while others died," he said quietly. "The confluence species that existed in your time are all gone now, and replaced by new civilizations that rose during our exile, but the principle remains the same." He turned to face Chen directly, and she saw in his eyes the same stubborn determination that had driven humanity to survive against impossible odds. "We do not abandon others to darkness," Zhang said, "not when we have the power to stand between them and the void, and we spent 20,000 years gaining that power specifically so we would never have to run again." The Confluence Council had been meeting continuously for weeks to discuss humanity's offer of alliance, and the terms being proposed were generous almost to the point of seeming suspicious, because humanity asked for nothing except the right to establish their beacon network and train Confluence forces in. The new tactical doctrine Steltion brought the news to Chen personally, and the aquatic commander's tentacles performed the gesture that indicated joyful relief as they delivered the announcement. "The council has accepted the alliance," Tailshin said, "and they have requested that you serve as humanity's first ambassador to the Confluence, because you bridge the gap between what we were and what we are becoming." Chen accepted the position because she had no other purpose in this strange future where everyone she had known was dust in her own species had become something magnificent and terrifying and beautiful in ways she was still learning to appreciate. The first joint colony was established 6 months later on a world that had been devastated by the Harvester, but which human and Confluence engineers rebuilt together, using techniques that blended the best of both civilizations. Knowledge Chen attended the dedication ceremony and watched as young humans, barely out of training, worked alongside Confluence specialists who had decades of experience, while species that had been strangers learned to trust each other through the simple act of building something together. They will create wonders, Tailshin said from beside Chen as they watched the construction crews laugh together over shared meals. Despite requiring completely different nutritional inputs, your species and mine and all the others who have joined this alliance will forge a future that neither of us could have imagined alone. Chen nodded and felt the weight of 20,000 years lift slightly from her shoulders, because she could finally see that her sacrifice had meant something, and that the desperate gamble of the Exodus had paid off in ways that her generation could never have predicted. The memorial they erected at the Colony Center honored both the Confluence dead from the recent battle and the human crews who had vanished into the darkness 20,000 years ago, trusting that their descendants would find a way to survive and eventually return. Admiral Zhang spoke at the ceremony, and his words were broadcast across the entire Confluence network, reaching billions of beings who were still adjusting to the idea that humanity had returned from extinction. We stand here today because our ancestors refused to accept that extinction was inevitable. Zhang said they chose instead to flee into darkness, hoping to find light, and they succeeded beyond anything they could have dreamed. He paused and looked directly at Chen, who stood in the front row wearing her ancient uniform that had been carefully preserved as a historical artifact, even though she insisted on wearing it too. Formal occasions, Commander Chen and her crew represent the best of what humanity was before we changed. Zhang continued, their courage and sacrifice gave us the time we needed to learn and grow and become strong enough to return as allies rather than refugees. Chen felt tears on her cheeks because she finally understood that her mission had not failed, but had simply taken 20,000 years longer than planned to succeed. Ceremony ended with the lighting of a flame that would burn continuously as a symbol of the alliance between species and the commitment to stand together against any darkness that might threaten the galaxy. Chen remained after the crowds dispersed and stood alone before the memorial, watching the flame dance in the artificial breeze, while she thought about all the people she had known who would never see this moment. They would be proud, a voice said, and Chen turned to find a young woman wearing the uniform of the human armada with insignia that indicated she specialized in xenocultural studies. Your crew and your generation and all the humans who took the desperate chance of fleeing into the unknown. The young woman introduced herself as Lieutenant Sarah Chin Zheng and explained that she had been specifically assigned to help Commander Chen adjust to the modern era, because family took care of family even across 800 generations of separation. I have been studying the archive records from your time, Sarah said, and I wanted you to know that we remember and we honor what you did, even though you probably felt like you were just running away. Chen smiled because she had indeed felt like a coward during those first desperate days of the Exodus. When humanity abandoned the galaxy to save themselves, we ran, Chen admitted, but we ran toward hope rather than away from despair. And I suppose that makes all the difference. She looked out at the colony spreading below them, where humans and Confluence species worked together, building something new and beautiful from the ashes of near destruction. Your people did not forget us, Chen said wonderingly. 20,000 years, and you still came back. Sarah nodded and took Chen's hand in a gesture of connection across the impossible span of time. Humanity never forgets, she said simply. And we never abandon hope, no matter how